The great hall was silent, but it was a busy sort of silence. It was the quiet of a sleeping giant, holding its breath between performances. Dust motes, caught in the long, slanting rays of the late afternoon sun, danced slowly through the air above rows of empty velvet seats. Down on the main floor, a woman moved. Her name was Alara, though no one in the hall ever used it. To the ushers, the stage managers, the visiting musicians, she was part of the scenery, a quiet, efficient figure in a simple, dove-gray uniform. She pushed a cleaning cart with a squeaky wheel, a sound so familiar to her it had become a kind of white noise. The cart carried her arsenal, bottles of cleaner that smelled sharply of vinegar and citrus, a stack of soft, lint-free cloths, a feather duster with a long handle, and a small, powerful vacuum cleaner. Today, her domain was the auditorium itself. She started at the back, moving methodically down each aisle. Her hands, gloved in thin, yellow rubber, wiped the polished wooden armrests between seats. They were already clean, but this was about ritual, about care. She picked up a discarded program from the previous night's string quartet, smoothing its crumpled pages before placing it in her recycling bag. A lost scarf, cheap polyester, was folded and set on the armrest for lost property. Her eyes, a calm and watchful gray, took in everything but judged nothing. She saw the scuff mark on the aisle carpet from a careless heel, the tiny splash of dried red wine on the back of seat G14, the faint pencil mark on a balcony rail where a patron had perhaps tapped out a rhythm. She dealt with them all, her movements economical and sure. This hall, the Aurora, was her world. She knew its moods. She knew how it groaned softly at night as the heating system cooled, how it echoed differently when empty compared to when it was full of whispering people. She knew which floorboards on the stage creaked and which door to the service corridor stuck in dry weather. She had been working here for 12 years, ever since she and her daughter had moved to the city, needing something steady, something with health benefits. The work was hard on her back sometimes, but she didn't mind the solitude. In the quiet, she could think her own thoughts. Her thoughts today were practical. The grocery list for dinner. The need to check if her daughter had finished her homework. The persistent squeak in the cart's left wheel that she really ought to fix. But another part of her mind was always listening. As she worked her way toward the front, a new sound threaded into the silence. It was the sound of a piano, but it was broken, jagged fragments of scales. Loud, booming chords that dissolved into laughter. The same complex run played 3 times in a row, each time faster. On the vast, dark stage, under the cold glow of the work lights, a man was practicing. Or, more accurately, he was playing around. This was the maestro, the reason for the heightened activity in the hall today. He was a famous man, his face on the posters outside and on the covers of CDs in the gift shop. He had a head of wild, dark hair and wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His laughter was loud and confident, bouncing off the empty seats. A few people orbited him, a young assistant clutching a tablet and a water bottle, a balding manager in an expensive suit, a technician adjusting a microphone stand. They laughed when he laughed, nodded when he spoke. Alara kept to her task. She began cleaning the front row, the most expensive seats, the ones that sometimes smelled of expensive perfume and fine wool. She could feel the occasional glance from the stage, a flick of eyes over the anonymous cleaner. Then back to the important business of art. The maestro finished a flashy passage from a Russian concerto and slammed his hands down in a final dramatic chord. He spun on the piano bench. "It's dead in here without an audience, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying easily. "The piano feels it too. It's waiting for the heat of 1,000 breaths to really come alive." His manager chuckled. "It'll have that tonight. Sold out, just like always." The maestro stood up, stretching his arms wide as if to embrace the empty hall. His eyes scanned the gilded boxes, the soaring ceiling, and then traveled down to the front row. They landed on Ilara, who was carefully polishing the brass plaque on the end of the row that read Orchestra, A, slow. Genial smile spread across his face. It was the kind of smile a king might give to a particularly hard-working gardener. He nudged his manager and nodded in Ilara's direction. "Look at her," he said, his tone warm, performative. "She cares for the wood and the brass like it's her own. Such devotion to the temple of music." Ilara paused, cloth in hand, and looked up. She met his gaze for a second, then gave a small, polite nod before returning to her work. She wasn't shy, but she had no interest in being part of a performance for an audience of one, famous man and his sycophants. But the maestro was in a playful mood, buzzing with pre-concert energy and the need to entertain. He walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at her from his height. "You know," he called down, his voice echoing slightly, "you spend so much time caring for the outside of this beautiful beast." He patted the gleaming black flank of the concert grand piano. "You keep her shining so brilliantly. It's only fair you should get to know her heart just once." His assistant and manager smiled, anticipating the joke. Ilara straightened up, her hands clasping the cleaning cloth. She waited. The maestro spread his hands magnanimously. "After your shift," he announced, as if bestowing a great gift, "you should come up. I'll let you play a little tune on her. A reward for your excellent service." He winked. "We'll call it a private concert." A soft chuckle rippled through his small group. The idea was absurd and charming to them. The humble cleaner, awkwardly plinking out "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" on $1 million instrument under the indulgent gaze of a genius. It was a perfect, cute story he could maybe tell at a dinner party later. The heat of a faint, unspoken blush crept up Ilara's neck, but her face remained still, a calm mask. She felt the eyes of the others on her, expecting a flustered refusal, a giggle, a wave of the hand. Instead, she simply looked at the piano. Her gaze traveled over its elegant curves, the polished wood, the row of silent white keys. There was a depth to her look. It was more than just appreciation for its cleanliness. It was a recognition, old and familiar, and buried very deep. She looked back at the maestro, who was still smiling his charming, careless smile. She gave another small, brief nod. Not a nod of acceptance to his offer. Not really. It was more an acknowledgment that he had spoken. A server might give the same nod to a customer who made a difficult request. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the huge space. It was a neutral sound, giving nothing away. Then she turned, placed her cloth back on the cart, and pushed it slowly toward the side aisle, the squeaky wheel marking her progress. The sound faded as she disappeared through a service door, leaving the stage group in a slightly deflated silence. The maestro laughed again, a little shorter this time, and turned back to the piano. "Well, there you go. Maybe I've inspired a new career." He played a light, tinkling scale, but as his fingers moved automatically over the keys, a tiny, faint doubt nagged at him. It wasn't her words. It was the way she had looked at the piano. It wasn't the look of a stranger. It was the look of someone seeing an old friend across a crowded room, and choosing, for reasons of their own, not to say hello. He shook his head slightly, dismissing the thought. It was nonsense. He had a concert to prepare for. The cleaner was just a cleaner, and the world was exactly as it seemed. He launched into a vigorous passage, filling the hall with sound, pushing the quiet, gray-clad woman and her inscrutable nod completely from his mind. The evening arrived, wrapping the Aurora concert hall in a cloak of electric anticipation. Outside, a line of well-dressed people curved around the block, their breath making little clouds in the cool air. Inside, The mood was entirely different from the quiet afternoon. The air hummed with 100 conversations, the rustle of fine clothing, the clink of glasses from the lobby bar. It smelled of perfume, wool, and expectation. Alara was there, but unseen. During performances, her job shifted. She stood quietly at the end of a corridor near the fire exit, a discreet presence in her gray uniform. Her role was to be available for a spill, for a guest who lost their way, for any small emergency that might disturb this sacred bubble of the performance. She watched the river of people flow by, men in dark suits, women in shimmering dresses, their faces animated with the pleasure of a night out. It was a spectacle she observed with a kind of detached curiosity, like watching a nature documentary about a colorful, chattering species. Backstage, the maestro was a coiled spring. In his dressing room, he went through his rituals, stretching his fingers, sipping warm water, pacing. The playful man from the afternoon was gone, replaced by a focused, intense artist. He could hear the muffled roar of the crowd, a sound that always sent a familiar thrill and a sharp pang of nerves through his stomach. This was the feeling he lived for. This was the proof of his importance. When the house lights dimmed and the applause began, Alara took her moment. She moved silently through the now empty corridors, a ghost in the machine of the hall. She started her real work, emptying the bins in the lobby, wiping down the marble counters of the bar, collecting abandoned champagne flutes. The music from the auditorium was a distant, powerful wave of sound. It seeped through the walls, the grand piano now a thunderous, living thing under the maestro's command. She could feel the vibrations in the floor. She didn't stop to listen. She'd heard it all before the rehearsals, the sound checks, the concerts. The music was part of the building's weather. As she worked, her mind was, as always, elsewhere. She calculated how long the concert would last, the 20-minute intermission, the final applause. She planned her route to finish the lobby just as the first wave of people came out for intermission, then to slip into the auditorium to clean there during the second half, when it was empty. Efficiency was a kind of music to her, too. The performance, by all accounts, was a triumph. From her post near the bar, she could see the faces of the people streaming out at intermission, flushed with excitement. "Breathtaking," she heard a woman say. "His technique is unreal," a man murmured to his friend. The maestro's name was on every tongue, a sacred word. He was the magician, the genius, the center of this universe. The final roaring applause seemed to shake the light fixtures. It went on for a long time, a rolling storm of admiration. Then the doors burst open, and the crowd poured out, a noisy, happy river heading for coats and cars and late-night dinners. The energy left the building slowly, like air from a balloon. Alara waited until the last patron had drifted out, until the ushers had gathered their things and left. The great hall was handed back to the silence and to her. She pushed her cart through the double doors and into the auditorium. It was a strange sight after the crowd, a sea of empty, rumpled seats, discarded programs on the floor, the air still warm and thick with the smell of the crowd. The stage lights were still on, casting a bright pool on the grand piano, which stood like a proud, black animal after a successful hunt. And then she saw that the hunt's victor was still there. The maestro was on stage, but he wasn't alone. A small, devoted cluster remained his manager. His eager young assistant, a wealthy-looking older couple who were major donors to the hall, and a critic from the newspaper who was shaking the maestro's hand vigorously. The maestro was glowing. The fierce concentration from before the concert had melted into a radiant, expansive joy. He was laughing, accepting praise, his eyes bright with success and the last drops of adrenaline. Alara quietly began her work in the front row, picking up programs, straightening seat cushions. She was careful to be silent, to not intrude. She was just part of the cleanup process, As natural and expected as the janitor who would come later to sweep. The maestro's voice, loud and carried by the excellent acoustics, reached her easily. He was telling an anecdote about a mistake in a performance years ago, his voice full of theatrical humility. His eyes swept over the empty hall, basking in its post-concert emptiness, and they landed on the familiar gray uniform in the front row. A spark of recognition lit his face. The cleaner from the afternoon, the one he'd joked with. The memory, wrapped in the warm gauze of his triumph, seemed charming to him. Here was a perfect bookend to his perfect night. A gesture of generosity from the peak of his mountain. He raised a hand, interrupting the critic mid-sentence. "Ah, look," he announced, his voice echoing in the space. Everyone in his group turned. Elara slowly straightened up, a stack of discarded programs in her hands. "Our guardian of the keys," the maestro proclaimed, a wide, charming smile on his face. He walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at her. His small audience followed, their faces curious, amused. "This is the woman who keeps this palace shining. I told her earlier, as a reward for her dedication, she could play a little something on the old girl here." He patted the piano lovingly. The wealthy couple smiled, indulgent. The critic raised an eyebrow, sensing a potential human interest angle. The maestro's gesture was grand, full of patronizing warmth. He truly believed he was offering a rare, delightful gift. "Come," he said, his tone inviting but leaving no room for refusal. It was a command wrapped in a smile. "The night is still young. Don't be shy. We are all friends here. Play us a tune. Anything you like." He extended a hand toward the piano, as if presenting her with the keys to a city dot. His manager chuckled softly. The assistant grinned, pulling out her phone, thinking this might make a cute behind-the-scenes video for the maestro's social media. They all watched Elara. They expected a flustered shake of the head, a nervous giggle, hands held up in protest. They expected her to mumble something about not knowing how, about having to clean, about not wanting to bother them. For a long moment, Elara didn't move. She stood there under the gaze of these important, smiling people, holding her garbage. The bright stage lights made her squint slightly. She looked from the maestro's expectant face to the vast, black surface of the piano. The silence stretched, becoming awkward for the group on stage. The maestro's smile began to feel a little fixed. Elara's mind was very clear. She saw the options. She could shake her head, apologize, and go back to her work. That would be the easiest. It would confirm their world, where she was a kind, simple woman who knew her place. They would laugh kindly. The maestro would make a final gracious comment, and she would become a forgotten footnote in the story of his glorious evening. But something shifted inside her. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was a sudden, profound fatigue. A fatigue of being invisible. A fatigue of holding a secret so deep it had become a part of her bones. The maestro's offer, though a joke to him, felt like a key turning in a very old, stiff lock. She looked at the piano again. Not as a cleaner looks at a piece of furniture to be dusted, but as one looks at a shoreline after a very long journey at sea. Without a word, she walked to the side of her cleaning cart. She set the stack of programs down neatly. She pulled off the thin yellow rubber gloves, finger by finger, and laid them on the cart. The action was slow, deliberate. It drew everyone's attention. The simple act of removing work gloves in this setting felt strangely formal, like a surgeon preparing for an operation dot, and she walked to the short set of steps at the side of the stage. Her shoes, sensible black flats, were quiet on the wooden stairs. She walked across the wide stage, past the watching, slightly puzzled group, and stood before the piano dot. She did not look at the maestro. She did not look at the others. She looked only at the instrument. She reached out and with one finger gently touched the edge of the polished lid. as if greeting an old friend. Then she sat on the piano bench. She did not perch on the edge, as a nervous amateur would. She adjusted the bench slightly, pulling it closer to the keys with a smooth, practiced motion. It was a small movement, but it sent the first faint tremor of doubt through the maestro. Professionals adjusted the bench. Everyone else just sat. Ilara placed her hands in her lap for a second. They were plain hands. The hands of a woman who worked. They were neither particularly slender nor long. There was a small scar across the back of her right knuckle from some old accident. She took a slow, deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. She let the breath out, and as she did, the last trace of the cleaner in the gray uniform seemed to leave her body. The hall was utterly silent. The group on stage had stopped smiling. They were just watching, caught by the strange gravity of her stillness. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. Her posture was not stiff, but it was not relaxed either. It was poised, ready dot, and then she began to play. The first notes were not loud. They were not meant to be. They came into the silence like a memory forming, hesitant and soft. A single searching note in the bass, followed by a fragile chord in the higher register, sweet and sad at the same time. Then another and another, a gentle, rocking rhythm that was like a heartbeat, slowing down to remember something painful dot. It was Chopin. The maestro knew it instantly. Not one of the flashy, heroic ballades or the frantic scherzos, but a nocturne. The one in C-sharp minor. A piece often played by students, but one that contained a world of sorrow within its deceptively simple melody. It was a piece about longing, about nights spent alone with thoughts that won't leave you be. But this was not a student playing. Her hands, those ordinary, work-worn hands, moved over the keys with a certainty that was shocking. The touch was everything. It was featherlight in the quiet passages, making the piano whisper secrets. Then, as the melody swelled with emotion, her fingers pressed deeper, drawing out a sound that was rich and singing, never harsh, never banging. She had complete control, but it wasn't the control of a technician showing off. It was the control of someone guiding a powerful feeling, letting it flow without letting it break loose. The maestro's amused, patronizing smile had vanished within the first 3 seconds. His face went slack, then tightened into an expression of pure, stunned concentration. His head tilted slightly, as if trying to catch a faint, distant signal. His professional ear, trained over decades, was dismantling what he heard, and it made no sense that the notes on the page were being followed, yes. But the music she was making was something else entirely. She took tiny pauses, breaths in the flow of the melody that made it ache. She softened a note here, let another ring a fraction longer there. It was an interpretation that was deeply personal, deeply lived in. It sounded less like a performance and more like a confession. The small group on the stage stood frozen. The manager's mouth, which had been ready to shape itself into an amused smile, hung slightly open. The young assistant had forgotten her phone entirely. It hung limply at her side. The wealthy couple, who knew enough about music to recognize profound artistry when they heard it, exchanged a glance of pure astonishment. The critic's pen, poised over a notepad, did not move. All of them were held captive, but the maestro was a prisoner. He felt a cold, strange sensation start in his stomach and spread outwards. It was the feeling of a fundamental mistake, a crack appearing in the floor of his understanding of the world. This woman, this cleaner in her service uniform, was playing with the maturity of a seasoned concert artist. No, it was more than that. She was playing with a kind of emotional wisdom he often strived for, but knew he sometimes faked with volume and speed. Her playing had no facade. It was raw and true. He watched her hands. They moved with an economy that was beautiful to see. There was no wasted motion, No theatrical flourish. The scar on her knuckles stretched and contracted. He saw the slight calluses on her fingertips, not from piano keys, but from work. The contrast was dizzying. These were hands that scrubbed floors and polished brass, and they were also hands that could conjure a soul from a box of wood and wire. The music built, a wave of rising emotion. She leaned into it slightly, her body responding to the force of the sound she was creating. For the first time, her face changed. The calm, neutral mask softened. A faint line appeared between her eyebrows. A shadow of old pain touched the corners of her mouth. She was not here with them on this stage anymore. She was somewhere in the memory the music held. The maestro found himself forgetting who she was, forgetting the absurdity of the situation. He was just listening, really listening. He heard the loneliness in the phrases, a loneliness so complete it was peaceful. He heard the bursts of passionate yearning that followed, only to fall back into resignation. This wasn't just Chopin's nocturne. This was her nocturne. She was telling them a story without words, and the story was about loss, and about carrying on quietly despite it. A specific, difficult passage approached a run of fast, intricate notes in the right hand, while the left hand held the steady, haunting rhythm. It was a spot where many pianists, even good ones, would get clumsy or rushed. The maestro leaned forward almost imperceptibly, his own muscles tensing as if to play it himself. Her right hand flew across the keys, not with blistering speed, but with a flawless, liquid clarity. Every note was distinct, a string of pearls, each one perfectly placed. It was effortless. It was masterful. And it was in the service of the emotion, not to impress. That was the moment the last of his assumptions shattered completely. This was no lucky amateur with one well-rehearsed piece. This was a level of technique that spoke of years, maybe a lifetime, of the most serious study. A hot wave of shame washed over him, brief but scalding. His joke, his grand, generous offer, echoed in his head now, sounding crude and foolish. "Play us a little tune." He had been offering a treat to a child. He had been performing his own generosity for an audience. He felt exposed, as if the bright stage lights were now showing him up for something shallow. The music began to wind down, returning to the mournful simplicity of the opening. The sadness was deeper now, infused with the journey it had taken. She played the final, quiet chords, letting them fade into the air until they were just a vibration, a ghost of sound, and then it was over. Her hands settled back into her lap. The connection was broken. The woman who had been lost in the music was gone, and the woman in the cleaner's uniform returned. She sat perfectly still for a few heartbeats, her head bowed slightly, as if paying respect to the silence she had just created. The hall was absolutely, profoundly quiet. It was a different silence than before. Before, it was an empty silence, waiting to be filled. Now, it was a full silence, heavy with the echo of what they had just witnessed. No one clapped. Clapping would have been a violation, like shouting in a sacred space. The critic slowly, carefully, closed his notepad. The wealthy woman had brought a hand to her chest. The maestro realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out in a slow, shaky stream. He looked at the woman on the bench, then at the piano, then back at her. The question screamed in his head. Asterisk, who are you? Where did this come from? How is this possible? Asterisk, but in that thick, resonant quiet, under the gaze of the others who had heard it too, he could not form a single word. He could only stare, his earlier triumph now feeling cheap and distant, replaced by a humbling, awe-struck confusion. The world had just tilted on its axis, and he was struggling to find his balance. The punchline of his own joke had been a revelation, and he was the only one who didn't understand it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, layered, almost physical. It pressed in on the small group on the stage, holding them in place. The air still seemed to vibrate with the last dying note. A ghost of sound that had settled into their bones. The woman on the piano bench, Ilara, simply sat. Her shoulders rose and fell with one slow, deep breath, as if she were surfacing from deep water. Then, with a movement that was neither hurried nor reluctant, she stood up. The wooden bench creaked softly, the sound absurdly loud in the quiet. She did not look at any of them. Her gaze was down, thoughtful, as if checking to make sure her feet were steady beneath her. It was the maestro who broke. The pressure of the questions in his head became too great. The sound that came from his mouth was not his usual confident baritone. It was hushed, scraped raw with disbelief. Where? He began, then stopped. He cleared his throat and tried again, his voice a dry whisper. Where did you learn to play like that? The other people on the stage seemed to let out a collective breath they'd been holding. The spell of the music was broken, but a new, more urgent spell had taken its place, the spell of a mystery. The critic leaned forward, his reporter's instinct kicking in. The wealthy couple stared, their faces a mix of awe and intense curiosity. The manager just looked profoundly lost, as if the rules of his profession had just been rewritten. Ilara turned to face the maestro. The bright stage lights cast shadows under her eyes, making her look tired, but her expression was calm. The faint pain that had touched her features during the music was gone, tucked away again. She looked at him directly, and for the first time, he felt truly seen by her. It was an uncomfortable feeling. At the conservatory, she said. Her voice was the same quiet, clear tone she had used earlier. It held no pride, no defiance. It was just a fact. Which conservatory? The critic asked, unable to stop himself. His mind was already racing, trying to place her. Had she been a child prodigy? A student of some famous teacher who had disappeared? Ilara's eyes shifted to him briefly, then back to the space between them all. In Leningrad, she said. A new kind of silence fell, shorter but sharper. Leningrad, the old name for a city that had lived through a siege, a city with a musical heritage that was legendary and brutal. The maestro felt a cold understanding begin to dawn, mixed with a deeper, more frightening ignorance. The Leningrad Conservatory? He said, the name feeling heavy on his tongue. It was one of the most rigorous, most competitive music schools in the world. To have studied, it was a mark of incredible, almost unimaginable talent and dedication. Ilara gave a single small nod. She wrapped her arms around herself, a subtle gesture that made her look smaller in her uniform. The story wasn't wanting to come out, but it seemed the first sentence had opened a door, and the rest was nudging its way through. It was a long time ago, she said, almost to herself. Then she looked at the piano, her expression softening. A different life, but the maestro's manager finally found his voice, confusion overriding his politeness. You work here. He said it not unkindly, but as a statement of an impossible equation that wouldn't balance. Ilara's gaze met his. There was no shame in it, only a profound and settled reality. Life does not always follow the score, she said simply. The wealthy woman took a small step forward. What happened? She asked, her voice gentle. Did you not want the life? The concerts, the travel? She gestured vaguely toward the maestro, as if he were the embodiment of that path. For the first time, a real tired smile touched Ilara's lips. It didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to play, she said. That is all I ever wanted. But the world, it changes. She paused, choosing her words with care, pulling them up from a place she rarely visited. There was unrest. Then there was leaving. A long journey with not much. There was a child to raise alone. Papers that were not right. A need for a job that was steady, that paid for an apartment and food and school books. She looked down at her uniform, brushing a bit of invisible lint from the sleeve. This job is steady. It has health insurance. It lets me be home in the evenings. Each sentence was a brick in a wall they could now see. The grand narrative of a concert career, of fame and stages, depended on 1,000 fragile things: stability, luck, politics, passport. Hers had shattered. The music hadn't died, but the path for it had been erased. The maestro felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. He thought of his own path: the supportive parents, the wealthy patrons, the right teachers at the right time, the lucky breaks. He had worked hard, yes, desperately hard. But he had never had to choose between his art and feeding a child. He had never had his entire country rearrange itself underneath his feet. His struggles had been about interpretation and competition, not about survival. He thought of his joke. Asterisk, play us a little tune. He had been standing on a mountain of privilege, tossing a coin down to someone in a valley, not knowing they had once owned the mountain. Did you ever play? He asked, his voice hoarse. After, professionally? Here and there, she said with a slight shrug. A little teaching when I could. Sometimes for a community church or for a small dance class. Nothing that paid the rent. She said it without self-pity. It was just the arithmetic of her life. The critic was scribbling furiously now in his notepad, but then he stopped, looking frustrated. This wasn't a story for a concert review. This was a private earthquake. The maestro looked at her hands again. The scar, the calluses. They were not the hands of someone who had given up. They were the hands of someone who had carried on, who had chosen duty over dream, who had protected a tiny flame of her gift through a long, cold journey. She hadn't lost her music. She had saved it. She had kept it safe inside her, a private, precious thing, until his careless words had accidentally pulled it out into the light. He felt small, not in a way that made him angry, but in a way that rearranged his entire sense of scale. His sold-out concert, the roaring applause, the glowing reviews that would be in the paper tomorrow, it all suddenly seemed like a loud, shiny game. What she had just played, with no audience, for no acclaim, was the real thing. It was music stripped of everything but its essence. It was his soul speaking. He didn't know what to say. I'm sorry felt insulting. Thank you felt inadequate. You are magnificent felt like stating the obvious and somehow cheapening it. Ilara seemed to sense the end of the conversation. The window into her past was closing. She gave them all a final polite nod, the same one she had given the maestro hours before when he'd first joked with her. It is late, she said softly. I have to finish my work. And with that, she turned and walked back across the stage. She did not look at the piano again. She descended the steps, walked to her cleaning cart, and picked up her yellow rubber gloves. She pulled them on, one after the other, the soft snap of the rubber against her wrists a sound of finality. The transformation was complete. The pianist was gone. The cleaner had returned. She pushed her cart, the squeaky wheel cutting through the heavy silence, and moved up the aisle toward the back of the hall, beginning to collect the rest of the discarded programs, ready to wipe away the traces of the evening's crowd, including the stunned group still standing on the stage, who were now just more litter to be cleaned up after. For a long time after she left, no one on the stage moved. The squeak of the cleaning cart's wheel faded into the depths of the hall, and then there was only the hum of the stage lights and the weight of what had just happened. The wealthy man was the first to speak. He let out a low whistle, a sound of pure astonishment. Good Lord, he murmured. His wife just shook her head slowly, her hand still over her heart. They gathered their coats, giving the maestro and his manager a look that was equal parts sympathy and disbelief. They murmured polite, shell-shocked goodbyes, and made their way off the stage, their footsteps echoing. They had come to see a famous pianist, but they would leave talking about the cleaner. The critic approached the maestro. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a car crash and a miracle at the same time. He opened his mouth, closed it, then simply said, I don't think I'll be putting this in the review. He wasn't being cruel. It was an act of mercy. The story was too big, too private, too damning for a simple concert critique. He gave a stiff nod and followed the donors out, already wrestling with how, or if he could ever write about what he'd heard. The young assistant, looking pale, whispered, Should I? Should I wait for you? The maestro didn't seem to hear her. After a moment, she too slipped away, leaving only the manager and the maestro alone on the vast, empty stage. The manager, a man who dealt in contracts and publicity, was completely out of his depth. He fumbled for something practical to say. Well, he began, his voice too loud in the quiet. That was unexpected. Quite a character. Probably a bit of a sad story, really. He was trying to package it, to put it in a box he could understand. Shall we go? The car is waiting. There's that supper at the mayor's. The maestro finally turned his head. He looked at his manager as if he were speaking a foreign language. The mayor's supper. Canapes and small talk, and people telling him how brilliant he was. The very thought made his skin crawl. No, he said, his voice flat. You go. I'll be along later. But, please, just go. Hearing the finality in his tone, the manager hesitated, then shrugged. He patted the maestro awkwardly on the shoulder and left, his footsteps quickly disappearing. And then the maestro was truly alone. The silence was different now. It was his. He walked slowly to the edge of the stage and sat down, letting his legs dangle over the side like a child. He stared at the piano. It was just an object again, a beautiful, expensive piece of furniture. But he could still see her there. He could still feel the shape of the silence her music had left behind. He replayed the last 20 minutes in his head. His glib offer, her quiet acceptance, the way she had removed her gloves, that first heartbreaking note. But most of all, he replayed her words. Asterisk, life does not always follow the score. Asterisk, he thought of his own life score. It was neatly written, bar after bar of practice, competitions, debuts, triumphs. It had crescendos of success and brief, manageable dips of criticism. It was orderly. He had composed it, or so he thought. He had believed his talent and his will were the sole authors. Her life score had been ripped up by history, by war, by exile, by the simple, grinding need to survive and provide. His joke tonight felt like the cruel punchline to a joke the universe had played on her decades ago. He had offered her a moment at the piano as a novelty, not knowing it was a piece of a world she had lost. A profound shame settled over him, not hot and flashy, but cold and heavy. It was the shame of understanding his own ignorance. He had lived in a castle of music, admiring its gilded walls, never thinking about the people who quietly kept the foundations from crumbling. He had mistaken his privileged place in the spotlight for the entirety of the musical world. He stood up, his body feeling stiff. He walked to the piano and sat on the bench she had used. It was still warm. He placed his own hands on the keys, his familiar, well-cared-for hands. He played a chord. It sounded hollow, showy. He tried a phrase from the nocturne she had played. Under his fingers, it was correct, polished, but it felt empty. It was just notes. He had played it 100 times, but tonight he realized he had never truly understood it. He had never had to live it. He took his hands away. His eyes wandered to the cleaning cart she had left near the front row. He stood and walked off the stage, his footsteps loud in the empty hall. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just needed to move Dot as he passed the cart. Something caught his eye. Tucked beside a bottle of cleaner was a small, worn, cloth-covered booklet. It wasn't a program. Curious, he picked it up. It was a book of piano etudes by Moskowski, a teaching book. It was old, its pages yellowed at the edges. He opened it gently. Inside, on the title page, was a stamp, property of the Leningrad State Conservatory, and below it, in faded blue ink, a name was written in elegant, cursive Cyrillic. He couldn't read it, but he didn't need to. He knew. Flipping through the pages, he saw tiny pencil markings fingerings, phrasing notes in a tight, precise script. These were the notes of a serious student, a brilliant mind mapping out the music. He saw a coffee stain on one page, a faint smudge that might have been a tear on another. This wasn't just a book. It was an artifact, a piece of that other life. It was probably one of the few things she had carried with her across an ocean and a lifetime. He held it, feeling its weight. She must have taken it out during a break, maybe to look at it while she ate her lunch in some back room, to remember. She must have forgotten it in the rush of the evening. Disturbed by his interruption, the maestro stood in the empty, silent hall, holding this small, fragile piece of her history. His manager would have called it a sad story. But holding this book, the maestro didn't feel sadness. He felt a kind of awe and a crushing sense of responsibility. He could give her money. He could offer her a job as an assistant, a teacher in his academy. But he knew, with a sudden, clear certainty, that those would be more versions of his joke. They would be grand gestures from the mountain, attempts to rewrite her score for her. They would insult the life she had built, the quiet dignity with which she carried her gift out. So what could he do? He carefully placed the book back exactly where he had found it, next to the bottle of cleaner. He did not take it. It was not his to take. He walked back to the center of the hall and just stood there, in the middle of all the empty seats. He looked at the stage, at the piano, at the cleaning cart. He made a decision. It was a small one. It was the only one that felt right. He would not speak of this to the press. He would not try to discover her. He would not make her his pet project. He would simply never forget. He would carry this silence with him. He would let it change the music he made from now on. He would play with more honesty, less pride. He would remember that genius has no address, and that sometimes the most profound art exists not to be celebrated, but simply to survive. He took one last, long look around the hall. Then he turned and walked up the aisle toward the exit. He did not look back. In the service corridor, Elara finished wiping down the last sink in the staff bathroom. Her mind was already at home, wondering if her daughter had remembered to turn off the stove. The echo of the nocturne was still inside her, a private warmth. Playing it had been like visiting an old, quiet room in her heart. It had been painful, but it had also been a relief, like stretching a muscle she hadn't used in years. She returned to her cart in the hall to get her personal things before clocking out. She saw the etude book where she'd left it. She picked it up and brushed a bit of dust from its cover, a small, private smile touching her lips. She slipped it into her bag. As she pushed her cart toward the storage closet for the final time that night, she noticed something. The squeaky wheel. It wasn't squeaking. She stopped and looked down. Someone had placed a small daub of thick, clear grease on the noisy axle. It was a fresh application, still wet. She stared at it for a moment. Then she straightened up, her eyes scanning the empty, shadowed hall. There was no one there, just the lingering smell of the grease and the immense, listening silence. She nodded once, to no one at all, and pushed the cart smoothly, silently, into the dark.